I've decided to give our lake cabin to my brother,
You knew
my
all
husband
along?
announced, lifting his
This
glass
entire
as our
time?
entire family applauded around
Yes.
the Thanksgiving table.
How could
34
you?
years of memories. Every
I never
mortgage
told you
payment I had
this, but I've
made,
been with someone
every
else for 20
holiday I had
years.
hosted. It was all
Oh,
dismissed with a
Robert, why
single
would you do
sentence,
this?
as if
Look
the
at him,
cabin
our
had
guy.
always been his to give
Oh, I'm
away.
just so humbled by
No
all
one
this.
noticed my hands trembling beneath the
Not as
table.
humbled as you'd like to
I simply
appear.
smiled, took
I
a
have
slow
something
sip of
important to
coffee,
share
and
that
looked at the
affects us
pumpkin pie
all.
waiting in the kitchen. "Let's wait until
Now, if you'll
dessert," I
excuse
said
me.
softly. Because by the time dessert was served, everyone in that room would learn who had truly owned the cabin all along. If you've ever been taken for granted by the people you loved most, I'd love to hear your story in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from, and what time it is where you are. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. And if emotional family dramas with unforgettable twists speak to your heart, please like this video and subscribe so we can share many more journeys together. People often assume that the deepest betrayals happen in a single explosive moment. A cruel sentence, a signature on the wrong document, a door slammed shut. But I've lived long enough to know the truth is quieter than that. Betrayal begins in tiny moments when someone slowly forgets the value of what you've sacrificed. By the time the final wound arrives, it's only the last stone added to a wall that has been rising for years. Our cabin wasn't simply a vacation home. It was the first dream I had ever managed to hold in my own hands. Long before I became Claudette Monroe, before I wore a wedding ring, or learned how to compromise with another person's ambitions. I was a 26-year-old elementary school teacher in Traverse City, Michigan. I wasn't earning much. Most months I balanced my checkbook twice because I couldn't afford mistakes. I drove the same aging Ford sedan until the floorboards began rusting through, and I spent more evenings grading papers than going out with friends. Still, every paycheck had one purpose: I saved. Some women dreamed about designer jewelry. Some dreamed about traveling Europe. I dreamed about a little piece of shoreline where I could hear loons calling across the lake at sunrise. My parents understood that dream better than anyone. Neither of them had much money, but they believed land represented stability. My father often said, "People can take almost everything from you, Claudette. They can fire you, they can insult you, they can forget your kindness, but land remembers who cared for it." When both of them passed away within 18 months of each other, they left me something far greater than wealth. They left me $32,000. It wasn't enough to change my life, but it was enough to begin one. I remember driving north one rainy Saturday with a local realtor who showed me several expensive waterfront properties that were completely beyond my budget. By mid-afternoon, embarrassed by my disappointed expression, he suggested one last parcel. "It isn't much," he admitted. The road leading there wasn't even fully paved. Tall pine trees surrounded a narrow clearing overlooking a quiet lake. There was no cabin, no dock, no electricity, just wild grass, cedar trees, and water so still it reflected the clouds like polished glass. The moment I stepped out of the car, I stopped hearing the realtor speak. I heard wind, birds, gentle waves brushing the shoreline. And for the first time since burying my parents, I felt something besides grief. I felt peace. I bought the property 3 weeks later. Every penny of my inheritance disappeared into that purchase. Some friends called me foolish. "You could have bought a nicer house in town. You'll spend years paying for improvements. You'll never build anything there." Maybe they were right. But every summer I camped there anyway. Sometimes in an old canvas tent. Sometimes sleeping inside my car when storms became too strong. I'd bring book sandwiches in a folding chair. I planted 2 maple saplings myself during the second summer. They're enormous now. Every Thanksgiving, I still glance at those trees before anyone else arrives. They're older than my marriage. I met Harold 2 years later. I was charming in the effortless way confident men often are. He built custom homes throughout northern Michigan, and he could look at an empty field and describe a house that didn't yet exist. I admired that gift because I lacked it myself. I could imagine classrooms full of children, but Harold imagined foundations, roofs, and fireplaces. When I first brought him to the property, he stood quietly for nearly 5 minutes. Finally, he smiled. "You picked the prettiest piece of shoreline I've ever seen." That sentence made me fall in love with him just a little. He didn't ask what the land was worth. He didn't joke about selling it someday. He simply appreciated it. Looking back now, I wonder if people slowly change, or if life simply reveals who they always were. After we married, Harold insisted on helping build the cabin. "I'll contribute the labor," he said proudly. "And I'll handle the financing," I replied. That arrangement made perfect sense to both of us. Every evening after finishing construction jobs, Harold drove north with his toolbox. On weekends, I'd arrive carrying groceries, payroll records, invoices, and another mortgage payment. He framed the walls. I wrote checks for lumber. He installed windows. I paid electricians. He built the stone fireplace with his own hands. I covered permits, insurance, plumbing, roofing materials, appliances, taxes, and nearly every expense that came afterward. Neither of us kept score. At least I never thought we did. Because marriage wasn't supposed to be accounting. Marriage was supposed to be partnership. Years passed. Children grew. Our daughter moved to Ohio. Thanksgiving became our family's sacred tradition. No matter where everyone lived, they returned to the cabin every November. The smell of roasted turkey mixed with cedar logs burning in the fireplace. Harold always carved the turkey. I always baked the pumpkin pies. Children played along the frozen shoreline, while adults argued about football inside. Every family photograph hanging in our hallway seemed to begin at that cabin. Birthdays, graduations, anniversaries, Christmas mornings when snow piled against the windows. The cabin witnessed every version of our family. Sometimes I think buildings absorb memories. If walls could speak, ours would tell stories no courtroom ever could. For decades, I believed Harold loved the cabin for the same reason I did. Not because of its market value, because it represented us. That's why the changes confused me so deeply. It started almost a year before that unforgettable Thanksgiving. Harold became strangely interested in real estate prices. He'd mention neighboring properties selling for astonishing amounts. "Lakefront values are unbelievable now," he'd say casually while reading the newspaper. I'd nod without thinking much about it. One afternoon he asked, "What do you think the cabin would sell for today?" The question felt odd. "We're not selling." "I know," he answered quickly. "I'm just curious." Curiosity became a frequent visitor after that. He downloaded property value reports. He watched renovation shows. He asked whether I still had old purchase paperwork. At first, I assumed retirement had simply given him too much free time. Then Walter began visiting more often. Harold's younger brother had always been friendly enough, but suddenly he stopped by almost every week. Sometimes they'd disappear into Harold's workshop for hours. Whenever I walked in, conversations ended. Once I heard Walter laughing. "You've been sitting on a gold mine all these years." The room fell silent as soon as they noticed me. Harold smiled too quickly. "We're just talking, talking." That word became his favorite answer. When I asked why bank envelopes kept arriving addressed only to him, he said they were discussing investments. When I wondered why Ashley had suddenly developed such an interest in our cabin, he said she was simply curious because she sold homes for a living. Every explanation sounded reasonable. Every explanation also felt incomplete. The strange thing about intuition is that it rarely screams. It whispers. Mine whispered every single time I looked toward our home office. I couldn't explain why. I only knew something inside me had begun paying closer attention. And although I didn't yet realize it, those quiet whispers were leading me towards the Thanksgiving dinner that would change my marriage forever. If someone had asked me 30 years ago what trust looked like, I would have pointed to Harold. How was the man who remembered to scrape the snow off my windshield before I left for work on icy mornings. He knew exactly how much cinnamon I liked in my oatmeal. Whenever I caught the flu, he made chicken soup from scratch, even though his version was always too salty. Those weren't grand romantic gestures, but they were the small habits that convinced me we were partners. That was why the changes hurt so much. Not because they were dramatic. Because they were so subtle that every time I noticed one, I found an excuse to explain it away. After all, people change as they get older. Retirement changes routines. Money worries make people quieter. Families go through seasons. At least that's what I kept telling myself. It was early spring when I first noticed Harold locking the home office door. For nearly 3 decades, that room had never needed a lock. We kept tax returns, insurance policies, family photographs, warranty manuals, and old Christmas cards inside filing cabinets that were probably older than our granddaughter. One afternoon, I walked in carrying a basket of laundry. Harold nearly jumped out of his chair. "Oh," he laughed awkwardly. "You scared me. I didn't know I needed permission to enter my own office." "You don't." He smiled. "It was just some paperwork." Paperwork. There was that word again. A week later, I noticed another small change. Our mail usually arrived around 11 every morning. For years, we'd sort it together over coffee. Bills, advertisements, birthday cards, magazines. Nothing exciting. Now, Harold insisted on checking the mailbox before I could. "It's good to stretch my legs," he said. Perfectly reasonable. Until I realized several bank envelopes never reached the kitchen table. One afternoon, while folding towels near the front window, I watched him standing beside the mailbox. Instead of walking directly toward the house, he opened one envelope immediately. He read something, folded the paper carefully, placed it inside his jacket pocket, then came inside carrying only the junk mail. When I asked if anything important had arrived, he answered without looking at me. "Just advertisements." I nodded. But something inside me tightened. Not because of the missing envelope. Because Harold had never lied easily. When he wasn't telling the truth, he avoided eye contact. He'd done exactly the same thing 40 years earlier, after accidentally denting my first car. The habit hadn't changed. Only the stakes had. Around that same time, Walter became almost a permanent guest in our lives. Harold's younger brother had always possessed a remarkable talent for making bad decisions sound temporary. Over the years, there had been failed restaurants, a landscaping company, a boat rental business, 3 different construction partnerships. Every time one venture collapsed, Walter would shrug. "You've got to spend money to make money." Unfortunately, Walter was usually spending someone else's money. Still, Harold never stopped believing in him. "They just haven't caught their break yet," he'd tell me. I used to admire that loyalty. Now I wondered if loyalty had slowly become blindness. Walter started visiting every Thursday afternoon. Sometimes they sat on our back deck overlooking the woods. Sometimes they disappeared into Harold's workshop. Whenever I brought coffee outside, conversations stopped. The silence was never natural. It felt interrupted, like walking into a room where someone had been discussing you moments earlier. One Thursday, I approached carrying fresh lemonade. Walter laughed loudly as I stepped onto the deck. "There she is." Harold forced a smile. "We were just talking about old times." "What old times?" Walter answered too quickly. "Fishing trips." I smiled politely. "You two haven't gone fishing together in almost 15 years. Neither man spoke. Walter picked up his glass. Harold stared toward the trees. It lasted only 3 seconds. But 3 seconds can say far more than 300 words. Then Ashley entered the picture. Walter's daughter had always impressed me. She worked hard. She earned her real estate license before turning 30. She dressed professionally, spoke confidently, and built a respectable career across northern Michigan. I'd watched her grow from an energetic little girl chasing butterflies around our cabin into a successful businesswoman. That was why her sudden curiosity felt so unusual. She invited me to lunch one Saturday. I just wanted to catch up. We met at a small cafe overlooking Grand Traverse Bay. For nearly half an hour, we talked about ordinary things: her clients, my retirement, the weather. Then she casually stirred cream into her coffee. "Aunt Claudette." "Yes. Have you ever considered downsizing?" The question surprised me. "No." "You know." She smiled politely. "A lakefront property like yours could probably sell for over $2 million now." I laughed. "It isn't for sale." "I know." She smiled again. "I'm only saying you've done incredibly well." When lunch ended, she hugged me tightly. But something about the conversation lingered. She hadn't asked about my health, my grandchildren, retirement. She'd asked about market value. The cabin seemed to be appearing in every conversation. That evening I mentioned lunch to Harold. Ashley says our cabin might be worth over 2 million. Instead of looking surprised, Harold nodded. Probably. You already knew. I've looked into it. I stared at him. When, oh, here and there. Why? He shrugged. No reason. No reason. Those two words echoed inside my head long after he went upstairs. The following week, I needed our homeowner's insurance policy for routine paperwork. The filing cabinet where we always kept important documents looked strangely organized. Too organized. Entire folders were missing. The drawer containing property records was nearly empty. I searched every cabinet. Nothing. When Harold returned home, I asked casually, "Have you moved the cabin documents?" He didn't hesitate. "I put them somewhere safer." "Where?" "I don't remember." "You don't remember. I'll find them." But he never did. The next morning after Harold left to meet Walter for breakfast, I quietly entered the office again. This time I looked more carefully. The filing cabinet had faint scrape marks on the floor, as though someone had moved it recently. Behind the bottom drawer, I discovered a single loose sheet trapped against the metal frame. It wasn't a complete document, only the final page. Across the bottom appeared signature lines. One bore Harold's signature. Another line was blank. The title at the top had been torn away. Whoever removed the document hadn't noticed the last page slipping behind the drawer. I stared at Harold's familiar handwriting. My heartbeat quickened. I didn't know what agreement he'd signed. But I knew one thing. He hadn't shown it to me. I carefully photographed the page with my phone before sliding it back exactly where I'd found it. For several minutes, I simply stood in the silent office. The room suddenly felt unfamiliar. Not because anything dramatic had happened, because secrets change the atmosphere of a home. The walls remain the same, the furniture doesn't move, but trust quietly leaves. From that day forward, I began noticing everything. Every whispered phone call, every unexpected meeting, every envelope, every missing file, every glance exchanged between Harold and Walter whenever they believed I wasn't watching. I never confronted them. Not yet. Some people mistake silence for weakness. In truth, silence can be the most powerful form of observation. The more I watched, the more one uncomfortable realization settled into my heart. This wasn't one impulsive decision. Whatever Harold and Walter were planning had been unfolding for months. And somehow, without realizing it, I had become the only person in the family who hadn't been invited into the conversation. As summer slowly gave way to autumn, one thought refused to leave me. If everyone else already knew the plan, how much longer before I was expected to discover it? I didn't have to wait very long. Thanksgiving was coming. And with it, the announcement that Harold believed would change all of our lives. By the time Thanksgiving week arrived, I had learned something about living with secrets. They have weight. Not the kind you can measure on a scale, but the kind that settles quietly across your shoulders every morning before your feet even touch the floor. You carry them while making coffee. You carry them while folding laundry. You carry them while smiling across the dinner table at someone you once believed would never hide anything from you. That Thanksgiving morning began before sunrise. I woke at 5 just as I had every Thanksgiving for more than 30 years. Outside the bedroom window, northern Michigan looked like a watercolor painting. A thin blanket of fresh snow covered the pine trees surrounding the cabin. The lake was almost perfectly still, reflecting the pale pink light spreading across the eastern sky. Smoke curled lazily from neighboring cottages where other families were beginning their own holiday traditions. For a few quiet minutes, I lay perfectly still. I listened to Harold breathing beside me. It struck me that after 34 years of marriage, I could tell what kind of mood he was in simply by the rhythm of his breathing. Today it was unusually peaceful. Too peaceful. Most Thanksgiving mornings, Harold was as busy as I was. He would already be talking about football games, asking whether the turkey had finished thawing, or reminding me to set aside extra cranberry sauce for Walter. Instead, he slept soundly, almost content, as though whatever had been troubling him for months had already been solved. I slipped quietly out of bed. The old pine floors creaked beneath my slippers exactly where they always had. Every board in that cabin had its own familiar voice. I knew which step to avoid outside the bedroom, which cabinet doors squeaked in the kitchen, and which window rattled whenever the north wind picked up. Some people memorize songs. I had memorized the sounds of that cabin. I wrapped my hands around a warm mug of coffee and stepped onto the back porch. The cold air stung my cheeks. Across the shoreline stood the two maple trees I had planted over 3 decades earlier. They towered over the cabin now, strong, rooted, patient. I smiled softly. "You've seen everything," I whispered toward them. "You'll see today too." Inside, I began preparing dinner exactly as I always had. Turkey into the oven, sweet potatoes peeled, stuffing mixed, pie crust brushed with egg wash. Cooking had always been my way of creating peace. Measuring flour and cinnamon required concentration. Chopping onions demanded attention. For a little while, the familiar rhythm allowed my anxious thoughts to quiet themselves. Around 8 o'clock, Harold finally appeared wearing his favorite flannel shirt. He kissed my cheek. "Morning, morning. The cabin smells amazing." I started early. He poured himself coffee. Normally, he would stand beside me while I cooked. Instead, he glanced repeatedly toward the front window. "Expecting someone?" I asked. He hesitated. "Walter wanted to come over early." "So early?" He said he could help. Walter had never voluntarily arrived early to help cook Thanksgiving dinner. Not once. Still, I simply nodded. Less than 15 minutes later, headlights appeared through the trees. Walter climbed out of his pickup truck wearing an expensive leather jacket that looked strangely new. Ashley followed close behind, carrying 2 bakery boxes. "Happy Thanksgiving," she called cheerfully as she walked through the front door. She hugged me warmly. "So good to see you, Aunt Claudette." "You too, sweetheart." She handed me the desserts. "I thought I'd save you a little work." "I appreciate that." Walter embraced Harold with surprising enthusiasm. "Big day." His words were casual, but something about the way they looked at each other unsettled me. Not excitement, expectation. Like two businessmen preparing for an important meeting rather than brothers gathering for a family holiday. Throughout the morning, little moments continued catching my attention. Ashley wandered through the cabin more than necessary. She admired the fireplace, measured the living room with her eyes, stepped onto the back deck, asked whether the guest bedrooms had ever been renovated. At one point, she even photographed the lake through the dining room windows. When she noticed me watching, she smiled. "The light is beautiful. It always has been." She slipped her phone back into her pocket. An hour later, I found Walter standing alone on the dock. Harold joined him moments afterward. The two men remained outside for nearly 20 minutes despite the freezing temperature. From the kitchen window, I couldn't hear their conversation, but I could read body language. Walter spoke rapidly. Harold nodded. Then Walter patted Harold's shoulder. It looked less like gratitude than encouragement, as though he were reassuring someone before a difficult performance. By late morning, more relatives began arriving. Our daughter Denise drove in from Ohio with her husband and teenage son. Harold's cousin Linda arrived carrying homemade rolls. Children filled the hallway with laughter. Coats piled onto beds. Someone turned on Christmas music even though Thanksgiving wasn't over yet. The cabin became wonderfully noisy. Normally, that kind of joyful chaos made me happy. Today, it only emphasized how isolated I felt. Everyone smiled. Everyone laughed. Meanwhile, I couldn't shake the feeling that an invisible conversation had been happening for months without me. Around noon, while basting the turkey, my cell phone vibrated. The screen displayed a familiar name, Michael Donovan. I stepped quietly onto the back porch before answering. "Happy Thanksgiving, Michael." His voice sounded unusually serious. "Claudette, I'm sorry to bother you today." "You never bother me." "I need to ask you something important." My heartbeat quickened. "What is it? Has Harold asked you to sign anything recently?" "No." "If he does today—" He paused. "Don't sign it." Cold air suddenly felt much colder. "Why?" "I'm still verifying something." "What kind of something?" "I'd rather explain in person." "Michael, I know today is Thanksgiving. I wouldn't call unless I believed it mattered." Silence stretched between us. Finally, I asked quietly, "Is this about the cabin?" Another pause. "Yes." Nothing more. Just one word. "Yes." Before I could ask another question, Michael continued, "Please trust me. If anyone presents paperwork today, tell them you'll review it after the holiday. Don't argue. Don't accuse anyone. Simply wait." My fingers tightened around the phone. Is someone trying to deceive me? I can't answer that until I've confirmed everything. But I promise this. His voice became firmer. You are not powerless. The call ended moments later. I stood motionless on the porch. Snowflakes drifted lazily across the lake. Inside the cabin, I could hear children laughing over a board game. Someone turned the television on for the football pregame show. Life continued as though nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Michael Donovan wasn't a dramatic man. During the 20 years he'd handled our legal affairs, I'd never known him to exaggerate anything. If he had interrupted Thanksgiving, there was a reason. I slipped my phone back into my sweater pocket. When I returned to the kitchen, Harold glanced at me. Everything okay? It was Michael. His expression changed almost imperceptibly. What did he want? I looked directly into his eyes. He said we should talk after Thanksgiving. Harold smiled. Sounds like Michael. He returned to arranging glasses on the dining table, but his hands had become noticeably less steady. For the first time in months, I saw genuine uncertainty flicker across his face. Only for a second. Then it disappeared. Dinner would begin in less than 2 hours. Whatever Harold had planned, whatever Walter expected, whatever Ashley believed was about to happen, they had no idea another person already knew enough to be concerned. I didn't yet know exactly what game was being played, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Before this Thanksgiving ended, someone was going to tell the truth. And somehow, deep inside my heart, I already suspected it wouldn't be Harold. By 3 o'clock, every chair around the long oak dining table was filled. That table had been the heart of our Thanksgiving tradition for decades. Harold and I bought it from an antique shop in Petoskey, just a year after we finished building the cabin. It wasn't perfect even then. One corner carried a permanent scratch from the previous owner's grandchildren, and one leg had always been slightly shorter than the others. Harold had joked that it leaned just enough to remind everyone no family was perfectly balanced. Normally, the room echoed with easy conversation. Football scores, favorite recipes, funny stories from childhood, arguments about whether pecan pie was better than pumpkin pie. This year, the laughter sounded different to me. Not because anyone was pretending, because I was listening for what wasn't being said. The turkey sat proudly in the center of the table, surrounded by bowls of mashed potatoes, roasted carrots glazed with honey, green bean casserole, homemade cranberry sauce, buttery dinner rolls, and my mother's old stuffing recipe that no one else had ever learned to make exactly right. Walter reached for a dinner roll before anyone else. "Still the best cook in Michigan," he said with a broad smile. "Thank you," I answered politely. Ashley complimented the table decorations. Denise showed pictures from her son's recent basketball tournament. Children laughed over spilled gravy. For nearly 45 minutes, everything appeared completely ordinary. If someone had walked through the front door, they would have seen nothing except another American family celebrating Thanksgiving. Only I knew that underneath every polite conversation, something was waiting. Harold barely touched his food. That alone told me more than words ever could. My husband loved Thanksgiving dinner almost as much as Christmas morning. Normally, he asked for seconds before anyone else had finished their first plate. Today, he kept glancing toward Walter. Walter occasionally nodded back. Ashley checked her phone twice before slipping it into her purse again. None of it escaped my attention. Neither did Harold's growing nervousness. I watched him lift his water glass. His hand trembled almost imperceptibly. He noticed. He quickly switched the glass to his other hand. No one else seemed to notice. I did. Years of marriage teach you how to recognize fear in someone else's smallest movements. Denise looked toward her father. "Dad, are you feeling okay?" Harold forced a smile. "Never better." Walter laughed loudly. "I think your father has something he'd like to say." The room became quiet almost immediately. Silverware rested against china plates. Even the children stopped talking. Harold slowly pushed his chair backward and stood. For a brief second, I remembered the day he proposed to me. He had stood almost exactly the same way, nervous, hopeful, looking around before speaking. Back then, his hands had trembled because he feared I might say no. Today, they trembled for an entirely different reason. He cleared his throat. I've been thinking a lot lately. Everyone listened. Our family has been blessed. Several people nodded. This cabin has given us decades of memories. It certainly has, Linda agreed warmly. Harold smiled. And that's exactly why I've made an important decision. My heart remained strangely calm. Not because his words didn't matter, because I'd already known they were coming. Walter folded his hands together. Ashley quietly picked up her phone and rested it on the table, pointing casually toward Harold. She wasn't scrolling. She was recording. I noticed immediately, Harold continued. My brother Walter has always been there for me. Walter lowered his eyes modestly. When we were boys, he protected me. When business was difficult, he encouraged me. When life got hard, he paused dramatically. He reminded me what family means. Several relatives smiled. No one suspected what came next. So today, Harold looked proudly toward Walter. I've decided to give the cabin to my brother. Silence. Not complete silence. Someone actually gasped. Another relative whispered, "Wow." Then Walter slowly stood. His face displayed the perfect expression of surprise. Too perfect. He placed one hand across his chest. Harold, you didn't have to do this. Harold walked around the table and embraced him. I wanted to. Applause erupted. Not from everyone, but enough. Linda clapped first. A cousin joined her. Someone said, "That's incredibly generous." Another relative smiled. "What an amazing Thanksgiving surprise." Walter shook his head as though overwhelmed with gratitude. "I don't even know what to say." Harold laughed. "You don't have to say anything." Ashley continued recording. She smiled proudly at her father. For a moment, I simply watched them. Not with anger, with extraordinary clarity. Every expression suddenly made sense. The secret meetings, the missing paperwork, the whispered conversations, the property questions, the rehearsed surprise. This wasn't spontaneous generosity. It was a carefully planned performance. The only person who hadn't been given a script was me. Denise finally looked toward me. "Mom?" She expected outrage. So did everyone else. After all, Harold had just announced he was giving away the place where I'd spent 34 Thanksgivings cooking every meal, decorating every Christmas tree, comforting every crying grandchild, celebrating every family milestone. He had spoken as though the cabin belonged solely to him, as though I were simply another guest. Walter looked at me carefully. He was waiting. Harold looked at me, too. His smile had become uncertain. Perhaps deep inside he had expected tears. Or yelling. Maybe even for me to storm away from the table. Instead, I picked up my water glass, took one slow sip, folded my napkin carefully. Then I smiled. It wasn't a sarcastic smile, nor was it forced. It was calm, almost peaceful. The room grew strangely uncomfortable. People don't know how to react when someone refuses to behave according to expectation. Harold frowned slightly. "Claudette." I looked at him gently. "You've finished?" He blinked. "Yes." I nodded. "Good." Another long silence followed. Walter shifted his weight uneasily. Ashley slowly lowered her phone. Even she seemed confused. Finally, Harold asked, "Aren't you going to say something?" "Oh," I smiled warmly. "I absolutely will." Several relatives leaned forward. I glanced toward the kitchen doorway where 2 pumpkin pies waited on the counter beside whipped cream. The smell of cinnamon drifted through the room. "I just don't think this is the right course." Harold looked relieved. "You mean?" "I think everyone should finish dinner first." Walter frowned. "What do you mean?" I stood slowly. "I've spent all morning making dessert. It would be a shame for it to get cold." Walter forced an awkward laugh. "Dessert can wait." I met his eyes. No. My mother always believed important family conversations should happen after everyone has shared a meal. I smiled again. So let's honor that tradition. Nobody spoke. Harold searched my face. Perhaps he expected hidden anger. Instead, he found only patience. Denise looked completely bewildered. Mom, aren't you upset? I reached over and squeezed her hand. Honey, I've waited months. I can wait another 15 minutes. That sentence changed everything. Walter's smile disappeared, completely. Harold looked suddenly confused. Months. I pretended not to notice his reaction. I'll bring the pie. I walked calmly toward the kitchen. Behind me, the dining room remained perfectly silent. No football announcer could be heard from the living room television anymore. Even the children sensed something had shifted. Inside the kitchen, I placed both hands against the counter and took one slow breath. My heart was beating faster now. Not from fear, from certainty. Michael's words echoed inside my mind. Don't argue, don't accuse, simply wait. I looked at the old wooden recipe box that had belonged to my mother. Beneath it sat a thick manila envelope, exactly where I had left it earlier that morning, untouched. Inside that envelope rested documents no one at the table knew existed. Documents that would soon tell a very different story than the one Harold had just announced. I picked up the pumpkin pie with one hand, the envelope with the other. Then I smiled to myself, because everyone believed dessert marked the end of Thanksgiving dinner. For my family, dessert was only the beginning. I carried the pumpkin pie into the dining room with one hand, and the manila envelope tucked discreetly beneath the dessert plate with the other. No one noticed. Every pair of eyes remained fixed on me instead. Silence has a strange way of growing louder than arguments. A few minutes earlier, the room had been filled with conversation, football commentary, drifting in from the living room, and children laughing upstairs. Now even the ticking of the old grandfather clock beside the fireplace sounded unnaturally loud. I placed the pie in the center of the table. No whipped cream, Walter joked, attempting to lighten the mood. I smiled politely. It can wait. Nobody laughed. Ashley quietly slipped her phone into her purse. Whatever she had expected to record, it clearly wasn't unfolding according to plan. I began cutting slices of pie exactly as I had every Thanksgiving for decades. One slice for Denise, one for her husband Mark, one for our grandson Ethan, one for Linda, one for Walter, one for Ashley. Finally, I placed the last slice in front of Harold. He looked up at me. Claudette. His voice sounded softer now. You don't have to make this uncomfortable. I set the pie server onto the table. No, Harold. I don't. I simply intend to make it honest. Those words settled heavily over the room. For several moments, everyone ate in silence. The pumpkin pie tasted exactly the way my mother had taught me to make it when I was 16 years old. Warm cinnamon nutmeg, a touch of maple syrup instead of refined sugar. Normally, watching my family enjoy that recipe filled me with quiet satisfaction. Today, I noticed almost no one was eating. Walter pushed his pie around with his fork. Ashley hadn't taken a single bite. Harold stared at his plate. Only Ethan seemed blissfully unaware that anything unusual was happening. Children often sense tension, but they don't understand its cause. Sometimes I envy that innocence. After several quiet minutes, I folded my napkin neatly onto the table. I have a story I'd like to tell. No one interrupted. When Harold and I built this cabin, we made hundreds of decisions together. I looked toward the fireplace. We chose every window, every cabinet, every light fixture. We argued over paint colors. A few nervous smiles appeared. I wanted green shutters. Harold insisted on blue. Walter chuckled. I remember that. So do I. I smiled gently. And eventually I let Harold have blue. The room relaxed ever so slightly. Then I continued. But there was one thing we never argued about. I looked directly at Harold. The cabin belonged to our family. He nodded slowly. Yes. So I found today's announcement surprising. Harold cleared his throat. I know I should have discussed it with you first. Several relatives nodded in agreement. That explanation sounded reasonable, almost convincing, if I hadn't known better. I tilted my head slightly. Discussed it? Or asked my permission? Harold hesitated. They're basically the same thing. No, I answered quietly. They aren't. Again, silence. Walter leaned forward. Claudette. I know this came as a shock. But Harold simply wanted to keep the cabin in the family. I looked at him calmly. It has always been in the family. Walter forced a smile. You know what I mean. I do. And I also know something else. His smile faded. Months earlier, Michael Donovan had given me one piece of advice that I hadn't fully appreciated until now. Don't accuse people. Ask questions. Truth becomes much stronger when people walk into it themselves. I folded my hands together. Harold, may I ask you something? He nodded. Of course. When exactly did you decide to give Walter the cabin? Harold answered almost immediately. A few months ago. A few months. Yes. What made you decide? He glanced toward Walter before answering. I've been thinking about legacy. Legacy? Yes. I nodded thoughtfully. So this wasn't a sudden idea. No. You've planned it for quite some time, I suppose. And during all those months, I smiled gently. Did you ever think to ask the woman who paid the mortgage? The room froze. Harold blinked. What? The mortgage? I repeated calmly. Did you ever ask me? He shifted in his chair. We both paid for the cabin. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I looked around the table. Does everyone here believe that? Several relatives nodded automatically. Why wouldn't they? For 34 years, Harold had been known as the builder. Naturally, people assumed he had built and paid for the cabin. Very few people ever ask who quietly writes the checks. I reached beneath the dessert plate and slid the manila envelope onto the table. Walter's eyes immediately fixed on it. Ashley stopped breathing for a moment. Harold looked genuinely confused. I wasn't planning to bring this out today. I rested one hand on the envelope. I had hoped Thanksgiving would simply be Thanksgiving. But after today's announcement, I think some history deserves to be remembered. Walter spoke quickly. Claudette, I don't think paperwork belongs at the dinner table. I smiled. Neither did I. But here we are. Ashley suddenly leaned toward her father. Dad? Her voice barely rose above a whisper. Walter didn't answer. Instead, he continued watching the envelope. Interesting. Very interesting. I hadn't even opened it. Yet Walter already looked worried. That alone told me plenty. I slowly untied the string securing the envelope. Nobody moved. Inside rested several folders. I deliberately left them there. Instead of removing anything, I asked another question. Harold, when was the last time you looked at the original purchase documents? He frowned. I don't remember. 5 years. Maybe. 10. I don't know. I nodded. I thought so. Walter interrupted. What difference does it make? I turned toward him. It makes all the difference. His expression hardened. You don't have to embarrass everyone. I'm not embarrassing anyone. I simply believe facts deserve a voice. Harold looked increasingly uncomfortable. Claudette, I know you're upset, but this doesn't have to become a legal discussion. The word legal caught everyone's attention. Denise looked from her father to me. Legal. I noticed Ashley quietly reaching toward her purse again. Perhaps for her phone. Perhaps not. Either way, she stopped when I looked at her. I continued speaking gently. When Harold announced he was giving Walter the cabin, I realized something. I've spent 34 years making sure everyone who entered this house felt welcome. I've hosted birthdays, Christmas mornings, graduation celebrations, baby showers, retirement parties. I've never once asked who deserved to be here. My voice remained calm. But today, I looked at Harold. I discovered someone believed they could decide the future of my parents' final gift without ever asking me. Denise frowned. Mom, what do Grandpa and Grandma have to do with this? I smiled softly. Everything. Walter abruptly pushed his chair backward. I think we've heard enough. He stood. I appreciate Harold's generosity. If this conversation is upsetting anyone, perhaps we should continue another day. Interesting. Very interesting. A man eager to receive a valuable cabin suddenly wanted to leave before any documents were opened. I looked toward him. Sit down, Walter. My voice never rose, yet something in it made him pause. I've waited months. You can spare another 5 minutes. He slowly lowered himself back into his chair. Nobody spoke. The fire crackled softly inside the stone fireplace Harold had built decades earlier. Outside, snow drifted gently across the frozen shoreline. Inside, 34 years of assumptions were beginning to crack. I rested my fingertips on the first folder. I met with Michael Donovan several weeks ago. Harold's eyes widened. You what? I asked him to review every document connected to this property. Walter's face lost its remaining color. Ashley closed her eyes for just a second. Harold looked completely stunned. You hired Michael? No. I consulted an attorney who has represented our family for 20 years. I paused. And what he discovered convinced me that today needed to happen. The room fell silent once more. No one knew exactly what Michael had found. Not even me, not all of it. He had intentionally refused to explain everything over the phone. He had only asked me to wait, to observe, to remain calm. Now, watching Walter struggle to maintain his composure while Harold looked more confused than guilty, I realized something important. Whatever Michael had uncovered, it was even bigger than I had imagined. And before this Thanksgiving dinner was over, the truth buried inside those folders was finally going to come into the light. For several long seconds, no one moved. The only sound inside the cabin was the soft crackling of the fire and the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. It was remarkable how quickly a room filled with conversation could become painfully quiet. I looked around the table. 34 Thanksgivings. 34 years of birthdays, anniversaries, Christmas mornings, and family reunions had unfolded inside these walls. Every face before me carried a memory connected to this cabin. That was exactly why I refused to let anger become the loudest voice in the room. Michael Donovan had warned me not to accuse anyone. He was right. People become defensive when they're attacked, but they reveal themselves when they're asked simple questions. I rested my hands gently on top of the manila envelope. I'm not going to read these documents yet. Several people looked visibly relieved, Walter especially. His shoulders lowered just enough for me to notice. Good. He still believed he had time. Instead of opening the envelope, I looked directly at Harold. I only want to ask you one question, he swallowed. All right. His confidence had faded considerably since his announcement. The proud smile he'd worn only 20 minutes earlier was gone, replaced by uncertainty. I spoke calmly. Harold, when we bought this property all those years ago, whose name was on the original purchase agreement? His forehead wrinkled. What? The original purchase agreement. The day the land was purchased. Whose name was written on it? He stared at me. For the first time that afternoon, Harold didn't answer immediately. He looked toward Walter. Walter looked back at him. It was only a brief glance, barely a second. But after 34 years of marriage, I had become fluent in Harold's silences. He was searching for reassurance, finding none. Finally, he chuckled awkwardly. Why does that matter? I smiled gently. Because I asked. The room remained perfectly still. Harold rubbed the back of his neck. It was a long time ago. It was. I don't remember exactly. Try. He frowned. I'm sure both our names were on it. I tilted my head. You're sure? I think so. You think so? Well, he hesitated again. I mean, I built the cabin. I didn't ask who built it. I asked whose name appeared on the purchase agreement. Walter suddenly cleared his throat. This seems unnecessary. I turned toward him politely. Does it? We all know you and Harold owned it together. I nodded. Do we? Walter shifted in his chair. Ashley stared down at her untouched slice of pie. Even Denise looked confused now. She glanced from me to her father. Dad, you really don't remember. Harold forced another uneasy smile. Sweetheart, it was over 30 years ago. People forget things. I folded my hands. I agree. People do forget. They forget birthdays. They forget anniversaries. They forget where they left their reading glasses. I paused. But ownership, I let the question linger. That's usually something people remember. Linda quietly set down her coffee cup. I always assumed you two bought it together. So did I, another cousin admitted. Several relatives nodded. Of course they did. Why wouldn't they? For decades, Harold had proudly told people he built the cabin. No one ever asked who had purchased the land before construction even began. I looked toward Denise. Honey, do you know when your father first visited this property? She shook her head. No. He visited 2 years after I bought it. Her eyebrows lifted. You bought it before you met Dad? Yes. The room grew noticeably quieter. Harold looked at me. I don't understand where you're going with this. I'm not going anywhere. I'm remembering, Walter interrupted. Claudette, nobody is questioning what you've done for this family. I smiled. No. Then why was today's announcement made as though I were merely another guest sitting at this table? Walter opened his mouth, closed it again. Harold sighed. I wasn't trying to disrespect you. Weren't you? I simply wanted Walter to have the cabin. You wanted to give away something. I leaned forward slightly. My question is, did you ever stop to ask whether it was yours to give? That sentence landed heavily. Mark looked toward Denise. Denise stared at her father. Even Ethan, who had been quietly eating pie, sensed the adults were discussing something important. Harold's face flushed. Of course it was ours. Our cabin. Our marriage. Our family. I nodded slowly. Our marriage. Yes. Our family. Yes. But ownership isn't decided by sentiment. It's decided by facts. Walter suddenly laughed. It sounded forced. Come on. We're talking like lawyers now. No, I answered. We're talking like adults. Ashley finally spoke for the first time in several minutes. Aunt Claudette. I don't think Uncle Harold meant anything hurtful. I looked at her kindly. I believe he didn't understand how hurtful it would be. Her eyes lowered. That wasn't the response she'd expected. She had prepared herself for anger, not calm honesty. There is tremendous power in remaining composed while everyone else becomes uncomfortable. I could almost feel the atmosphere changing. Earlier, everyone had accepted Harold's announcement without question. Now, questions were appearing everywhere. Linda spoke quietly. Harold, did you really never discuss this with Claudette? He hesitated. I planned to. When? No answer. After Thanksgiving. Silence. After giving Walter the cabin. Still nothing. Walter leaned forward again. This is getting ridiculous. We're family. We don't need legal technicalities. I smiled. Exactly. We're family. Which makes honesty even more important. His jaw tightened. The confidence he'd displayed during Harold's announcement had disappeared completely. Interesting. Very interesting. A confident man doesn't become nervous over one simple question. Only someone afraid of the answer does. I reached into the manila envelope. Immediately I noticed Walter watching my hands. Ashley stopped breathing again. Harold looked confused rather than frightened. That difference mattered. Walter appeared worried about what I might reveal. Harold appeared worried because he genuinely didn't know. For the first time all afternoon, I began wondering whether the two brothers understood very different versions of the same plan. I pulled out a single yellowed photograph instead of a document. The picture showed a younger version of me standing beside an empty lakeside lot. There was no cabin, no dock, no driveway, only pine trees, wild grass, and 26-year-old Claudette smiling beside a wooden sold sign. I passed the photograph to Denise. She stared at it. Mom, that's you. Yes. Where's Dad? He hadn't entered my life yet. The photograph continued around the table. Everyone studied it. Walter didn't. His eyes remained fixed on the envelope. That confirmed something for me. He wasn't worried about photographs, he was worried about paperwork. When the picture finally reached Harold, he looked at it for a long time. I remember this. You showed it to me when we were dating. I did. You said, his voice grew quieter, you'd finally found your little piece of heaven. I smiled sadly. I did. He looked up at me. Realization began creeping slowly across his face. Not complete understanding, just the first uncomfortable crack. I bought that land before I ever met you, Harold. Nobody spoke. I paid cash using the inheritance my parents left me. I continued gently. You built a beautiful cabin. I've never denied that. You worked hard. I've always honored that. I paused before asking one final question. So why? I looked directly into his eyes. Did you stand in front of everyone today and speak as though my story never happened? Harold opened his mouth. No words came out. For the first time since Thanksgiving dinner had begun, I saw something I hadn't seen in months. Not pride, not confidence, not defensiveness. Confusion. Real confusion. As though pieces of a puzzle he'd never bothered assembling were suddenly falling into place. Across the table, Walter quietly reached for his coat. He thought no one noticed. I did. Because people only prepare to leave when they know the next truth isn't going to help them. And the next truth was waiting inside the envelope resting beneath my hand. An original warranty deed, a mortgage statement, 3 canceled checks, a county property tax receipt. The yellowed paper immediately revealed their age. Denise leaned closer. These are old. Very old, I answered. The first year I owned the property. Harold stared at the paperwork. Walter avoided looking at it altogether. I slid the deed toward Harold. Would you read the owner's name aloud? His hands hesitated before touching the paper. For a brief second, I almost felt sorry for him. Not because he had embarrassed me, because I genuinely believed he still didn't understand how much had been hidden from him. His eyes scanned the document. The color slowly drained from his face. He swallowed. It says... His voice became almost inaudible. Claudette Louise Bennett. I smiled faintly. My maiden name. The room remained perfectly still. Linda whispered softly. So you really did buy it yourself? Yes, I nodded. 2 years before Harold and I met. No one argued. The paper spoke for itself. I reached for the mortgage records. Harold. He looked up slowly. Whose name appears here? He already knew the answer. Still, he looked anyway. Yours. And here, I slid over another page. Yours. And these canceled checks, again, my name. One after another, every document carried the same signature, mine. Not because Harold had refused to help, but because I had always managed the finances while he managed construction. That had never bothered me, until someone decided my contribution no longer existed. Denise carefully picked up one of the checks. Mom, you kept these. I keep important things. My grandson Ethan looked confused. So Grandma bought the land? Yes. And Grandpa built the cabin? Yes. He frowned. Then why didn't Grandpa say that? No adult answered. Sometimes children ask the questions everyone else is afraid to ask. Harold slowly lowered the paperwork. He rubbed his forehead. I honestly forgot. Nobody laughed. Because no one believed forgetting could fully explain what had happened. I believed he had forgotten something else. He had forgotten the difference between building a house and owning it. Walter finally spoke. So what? Several heads turned toward him. You bought the land. Harold built the cabin. You were married. It belongs to both of you. His voice sounded confident again. Too confident. I noticed Michael had been right. Walter wasn't worried about the history. He was worried about something else. I folded my hands. You're correct. Our marriage matters. Our years together matter. Everything we built together matters. I paused. But that's not the issue. Walter frowned. Then what is? I reached back into the envelope. This time, I removed a thick stack of receipts. Nearly every year was represented. Property taxes, insurance premiums, roof repairs, window replacements, septic maintenance, dock reconstruction, tree removal after a storm, new furnace installation. Every receipt had been carefully organized by year. I began laying them across the table. The stack seemed endless. Harold stared in disbelief. You kept all of these? I keep records. You know that. He nodded slowly. I just. I never realized. No, I answered quietly. You never asked. That sentence hurt him. I could see it. For years, Harold had proudly told visitors how he had handcrafted the stone fireplace milled cedar for the ceilings and designed the wraparound porch. Everything he said was true. But there had always been another story. The woman working overtime as a school principal. The woman who quietly wrote checks every month. The woman who refinanced nothing because she insisted on paying down the mortgage faster. Invisible work rarely receives applause until someone tries erasing it. Ashley finally spoke. Aunt Claudette. I'm sorry. Her voice trembled. I honestly didn't know. I believed her. She probably knew about the transfer. She probably knew about Walter's financial problems. But looking at her face now, I realized she truly hadn't known the history. She had inherited assumptions, just as everyone else had. Walter, however, remained strangely tense. His gaze never rested on the receipts for long. Instead, it kept drifting toward the envelope still sitting beside my arm. There it is. Michael hadn't been protecting me from these documents. These were only history. Something else remained inside. Something Walter feared. Harold suddenly looked at me. Claudette, I'm so sorry. His apology came quietly, not dramatically, not for the family, for me. I should have talked to you. You should have. I wasn't trying to erase what you did. I know. You don't. I know you weren't trying. He looked relieved. Then I finished my sentence. You simply never realized you'd already erased it years ago. Those words hit him harder than anger ever could. His shoulders sagged. He looked older, much older. For the first time since we sat down for dinner, I saw genuine regret replacing confusion. Walter interrupted. Harold, we can work this out later. No, Harold answered without looking at him. We're staying. Interesting. That was the first time all afternoon Harold had disagreed with his brother. Walter noticed it too. His jaw tightened. I gently gathered the receipts back into a neat stack. These documents aren't why Michael Donovan called me. Every head lifted. Harold frowned. What do you mean? I rested my hand on the envelope again. He already knew I owned the land. He already knew I paid the mortgage. That's public record. Walter stopped breathing for a second. Barely noticeable. But I saw it. Michael hadn't sounded worried because of old deeds. He had sounded worried because he'd discovered something recent. Something serious. I slowly reached into the envelope once more. This time my fingers touched a sealed legal folder. Unlike everything else, it was new. Bright white, recently printed. Across the front, Michael had written only 4 words in blue ink. Open at the table. Nothing more. No explanation. No notes. Just those 4 words. I held the folder in my hands but didn't open it immediately. Instead, I looked around the room, at Denise, at Ethan, at Linda, at Ashley, finally, at Harold. I don't know everything inside this folder. Several people looked surprised. I asked Michael not to explain it over the phone. I wanted all of us to hear the truth together. Harold's voice barely rose above a whisper. Is it really that serious? Before I could answer, the front doorbell rang. Everyone jumped. 3 slow chimes echoed through the cabin. No one had been expecting another guest. I glanced toward the clock. Exactly 4:30. Right on time. I stood. I believe that's Michael. Walter's face turned completely pale. And in that single moment before the attorney had even stepped through the front door, I finally knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever Walter had been hiding, it was far worse than simply trying to take my cabin. The second chime echoed through the cabin just as I reached the front door. No one followed me. Behind me, I could feel every pair of eyes watching, waiting to see whether the next few moments would confirm their fears or erase them. Even before I turned the brass handle, I knew who stood on the other side. Michael Donovan had never been late to anything in the 20 years I'd known him. When I opened the door, the cold November air swept inside, carrying the scent of pine and fresh snow. Michael stood on the porch in a charcoal overcoat, a leather briefcase tucked beneath one arm. His silver hair was damp with snowflakes, but his expression remained as composed as ever. "Happy Thanksgiving, Claudette." "Happy Thanksgiving, Michael." He looked past me into the dining room. "I hope I'm not interrupting dessert." I smiled faintly. "Actually, you arrived at exactly the right time." He stepped inside, removed his coat, and greeted everyone politely. "Good afternoon." Most of the family returned his greeting. Walter barely nodded. Ashley couldn't bring herself to make eye contact. Harold stood slowly. "Michael, I wasn't expecting you." "I imagine not." Michael's tone was courteous, but there was a firmness beneath it that immediately changed the atmosphere in the room. I gestured toward the empty chair beside me. "Please." He sat down carefully, placing his briefcase beside his feet. For several moments, no one spoke. Finally, Harold broke the silence. "Claudette said you've been reviewing some documents." Michael folded his hands. "She asked me to review the legal history of the cabin." Walter leaned back in his chair. "Seems like overkill." Michael looked at him calmly. "I don't believe accuracy is ever excessive." Walter looked away. I noticed Michael studying everyone's faces before continuing. Experienced attorneys rarely rush. They let silence do part of the work. Finally, he spoke. "When Claudette contacted me several weeks ago, she wasn't trying to start a lawsuit." I nodded. "I simply wanted answers." "Exactly," Michael continued. "She was concerned because important property records had disappeared from her filing cabinet." Harold immediately looked toward me. "You thought I took them." "I knew someone had." His shoulders slumped. "I moved them." "I know." His answer surprised several people, even me. Michael nodded. "Harold voluntarily told me that during our first meeting." Walter shifted uncomfortably. Michael continued. "He also told me he believed he was preparing documents to transfer ownership of the cabin." Harold frowned. "Preparing?" "I wasn't preparing. I already signed them." Walter's head snapped toward him. Michael remained perfectly calm. "No. You signed something, but not what you believed." The room became absolutely silent. Harold blinked several times. "I don't understand." "I'd like to." Michael opened his briefcase. Instead of removing a thick stack of papers, he placed only one photocopy on the table. "I'd appreciate it if everyone looked carefully." The paper slowly moved around the table. It wasn't a deed. It wasn't a sales contract. It wasn't a transfer document. It was a loan application. Walter's name appeared at the top. Not Harold's. Not mine. Walter immediately reached toward the paper. Michael gently stopped him. "It will come back to you." Harold stared at the document. "What is this?" Michael answered quietly. "A commercial refinancing application." Walter interrupted. "It doesn't matter." "It matters because the cabin appears repeatedly throughout the paperwork." Harold looked confused. "I never saw this." "No," Michael replied. "You didn't. You were never supposed to." The attorney removed a second document. "This application was submitted to a private lender." Ashley slowly closed her eyes. Michael noticed. "So did I." He turned another page. "The lender requested proof that Walter would soon acquire ownership of a valuable lakefront property." Walter's breathing became noticeably heavier. Harold stared at his brother. "What are they talking about?" Walter forced a laugh. "It's nothing," Michael calmly continued. "The lender required evidence. So several supporting documents were prepared." Harold frowned. "I signed documents." "Yes, but not a deed." Michael paused before choosing his next words carefully. You signed an affidavit stating you intended to transfer ownership of the cabin to Walter. Harold looked stunned. I thought that was the transfer. It wasn't. It was evidence used to strengthen Walter's loan application. Harold slowly turned toward his brother. Walter. Walter looked down at the table. You said, Harold's voice cracked. You told me we needed preliminary paperwork before the attorney could prepare the real transfer. Walter didn't answer. Harold continued. You said it was only procedural. Still nothing. I believed you. Michael nodded gently. I believe he did. The attorney wasn't defending Harold. He was distinguishing ignorance from intent. That mattered. Harold looked back at Michael. So, I never transferred the cabin. No. You lacked the legal authority to do so. Relief flickered briefly across Denise's face. Walter, however, looked ready to leave. Michael wasn't finished. He removed another folder. This is where the situation becomes more concerning. Walter stood abruptly. I've heard enough. I haven't. Michael's voice remained calm. You may sit down. For a long second it appeared Walter might simply walk out. Then he slowly returned to his chair. Ashley whispered quietly, Dad? He ignored her. Michael continued. The lender requested one additional item. He looked directly at Walter. Estimated market value. Ashley covered her mouth. Michael placed another sheet onto the table. A professional real estate valuation. Prepared 6 weeks earlier. Signed by Ashley Monroe. The room turned toward her. Her face flushed crimson. Ashley, Denise asked softly. Ashley swallowed. Walter interrupted sharply. Leave her out of this. Michael raised one finger. I can't. She didn't know everything. Walter's expression hardened. Michael looked kindly toward Ashley. When you prepared this valuation, what were you told? Ashley's eyes filled with tears. My father said, she struggled to continue. He said Uncle Harold had already decided to give him the cabin. She looked toward Harold. He said you wanted an updated valuation before final paperwork. Harold slowly shook his head. I never asked for one. Ashley stared at him in disbelief. You didn't... No. I thought... Her voice broke completely. I thought everyone already agreed. She began crying quietly. My heart ached for her. Unlike Walter, Ashley looked genuinely devastated. She had been manipulated too. Walter slammed one hand against the table. This is ridiculous. Michael didn't even flinch. No. It's documented. He opened the final folder. The lender denied Walter's refinancing request. Walter looked up sharply. Because they required proof of completed ownership. Michael nodded. They also requested verification from the county. When county records failed to match the application, questions were raised. Harold's breathing became uneven. So, Walter had never actually owned the cabin. He had only hoped to convince the lender that ownership was inevitable. Michael answered the question Harold couldn't yet form. Correct. Harold slowly looked toward his younger brother. His voice barely rose above a whisper. You weren't trying to keep the cabin. Walter said nothing. You were trying to borrow against it. Still silence. You would have mortgaged Claudette's cabin. Harold swallowed hard. Before you even owned it. Walter finally spoke. I was going to pay everything back. No one responded, because everyone in the room understood the same painful truth. A man drowning in debt almost never borrows against a valuable property, intending to leave it untouched. Harold lowered his face into his hands. For the first time since Thanksgiving dinner had begun, I realized something unexpected. My greatest betrayal hadn't come from my husband. It had come from the man he trusted enough to stop asking questions. And as I watched Harold's shoulders begin to shake with quiet regret, I understood that the hardest conversation of the entire evening was only beginning. No one spoke after Walter admitted he had intended to borrow against the cabin. His words hung over the dining room like smoke after a fire. You couldn't see them anymore, but you could still feel them in your lungs. I was going to pay everything back. The sentence sounded hollow now. Perhaps Walter even believed it. People who live on borrowed promises often convince themselves that tomorrow will somehow rescue the choices they make today. Harold slowly lifted his head. His eyes looked different, not angry, heartbroken. When did this start? He asked quietly. Walter rubbed both hands together. It got bad about 18 months ago. Your business, Walter nodded. The commercial projects stopped coming. I lost 2 contracts. Then interest rates climbed. I started borrowing just to keep payroll going. Michael remained silent. He understood this conversation no longer belonged to lawyers, it belonged to brothers. Harold leaned back in his chair. Why didn't you tell me? I was ashamed. So instead, Harold's voice cracked. You decided to trick me. Walter shook his head quickly. I never wanted to trick you. You asked me to help. I did. You said the paperwork was just the first step before we visited an attorney. Walter looked down. I know. You told me ownership couldn't change until Claudette signed. I believed you. Walter remained silent. Harold closed his eyes for several seconds. I signed those papers because you're my little brother. No one interrupted him. When Dad died, I promised Mom I'd always look after you. Walter swallowed hard. I remember. I believe that promise meant helping you. Harold slowly shook his head. I never imagined you'd use it against me. The words hurt everyone at the table. Not because Walter had betrayed me, because he had betrayed the one person who had defended him for decades. I looked at Walter. For the first time all afternoon, the confidence was completely gone. The charming smile, the easy jokes, the carefully rehearsed gratitude. All of it had disappeared. In its place sat a tired 61-year-old man who looked as though he hadn't slept well in months. Ashley quietly reached for her father's hand. Dad? He gently pulled his hand away. I got myself into this. She began crying again. I'm sorry. I should have asked more questions. Walter finally looked at her. No. This part isn't your fault. I told you everyone had agreed. You trusted me. Ashley's shoulders shook. I prepared that valuation because I believed Uncle Harold wanted it. Harold looked toward her. I don't blame you. She wiped tears from her face. I should have called Aunt Claudette. I should have. I reached across the table and gently squeezed her hand. We all wish we'd asked more questions. She nodded through her tears. Michael quietly closed his briefcase. His legal work was finished. Now only the family remained. Linda broke the silence. Walter, were you actually planning to move into the cabin? Walter laughed bitterly. No, I couldn't. Then what? He stared toward the fireplace. I needed collateral. I thought if I refinanced it, I could save the business. And after that, I would have sold some equipment, paid everything off. Eventually, Michael spoke for the first time in several minutes. The loan documents estimated nearly $1.4 million. Several relatives gasped. Denise stared at Walter. That much? Walter nodded without looking up. I owed almost $800,000, and penalties kept growing. The room became quiet again. That number changed everything. This hadn't been a temporary setback. Walter hadn't been searching for a little help. He'd been desperate. Harold suddenly stood. He walked slowly toward the large picture window overlooking the frozen lake. His reflection stared back at him through the glass. I keep thinking about today. Nobody interrupted. When I stood up before dinner, I honestly believed I was doing something generous. He laughed softly. What a fool. No, I answered. You weren't foolish. He turned toward me. You trusted the wrong person. Harold nodded slowly. I never even asked to see the paperwork. I signed wherever Walter pointed. He looked at Michael. If Claudette hadn't called you, Michael answered honestly, the loan likely still would have been denied. But your family might never have learned why. Harold looked relieved for only a second. Then another realization crossed his face. He turned toward me. You knew. I suspected. For months. Yes. And you never confronted me. No. Why? Every face at the table shifted toward me. It was the question everyone wanted answered. Why had I stayed quiet? Why hadn't I exploded the first time I found missing documents? Why had I waited until Thanksgiving dessert? I looked around the room. At the family photographs covering the walls. Children in Halloween costumes. Fishing trips. Christmas mornings. Graduation celebrations. 34 years of memories. I'll tell you why. I folded my hands together. If I had confronted Harold in July, he would have defended Walter. Harold slowly lowered his eyes. I continued. If I'd accused Walter without evidence, the family would have believed I was overreacting. Linda nodded slightly. She knew I was right. If I'd shouted today, the conversation would have become about my anger, not about the truth. I paused. So I waited. Denise whispered softly, "For dessert." "Yes." "Why dessert?" I smiled faintly. "Because by dessert, everyone had already shared the same table. No one could accuse me of ruining Thanksgiving. I gave everyone the chance to celebrate first. Then I simply asked questions." Harold stared at me. "You protected me. I protected our family." He shook his head. "No. You protected me from making an even bigger mistake." His voice grew quieter. "If Walter had somehow convinced another lender, if paperwork had continued, I could have lost everything," I answered gently. "We almost all did." Harold slowly walked back to his chair. Instead of sitting beside Walter as he had earlier, he sat beside me. The movement seemed small, but everyone noticed. Walter noticed most of all. He looked at his brother for several long seconds. "I never wanted to lose you," Harold answered without anger. "You should have thought about that before asking me to sign papers you didn't explain." Walter lowered his head. "I know." Michael stood. "I believe my work here is finished." Before anyone could respond, Harold spoke. "No." Michael paused. "I owe you something." The attorney looked puzzled. Harold extended his hand. "Thank you. For protecting my wife. When I failed to." Michael accepted the handshake. "You still have time to protect her now." Harold looked toward me. His eyes filled with tears. "I don't know whether you'll ever forgive me." I didn't answer immediately, because forgiveness deserved honesty too. "I haven't decided." The words hurt him. I knew they would, but after everything that had happened, offering false comfort would only create another lie. "I believe your apology. I believe you didn't understand everything Walter was doing. I even believe you truly thought you were helping your brother." I took a slow breath. "But Harold," he looked directly into my eyes, "you stood in front of our entire family and spoke as though my life's work belonged only to you." His eyes closed. "I know." "No," I answered softly. "I don't think you do. Not yet." The room remained silent. Outside, evening settled over the lake, and the first stars began appearing above the pine trees. Thanksgiving dinner had ended hours earlier. But the longest journey of the day, the journey back toward honesty, had only just begun. And for Harold, the hardest part would not be apologizing. It would be learning how to rebuild the trust he had spent years slowly taking for granted. No one reached for another slice of pie. The coffee had gone cold. The fire still burned in the stone fireplace, but somehow the cabin felt colder than it had all day. Michael quietly gathered his briefcase. "I'll leave you to your family." Before he could stand, I reached out and touched his sleeve. "Thank you." He offered me the same reassuring smile he had given me weeks earlier in his office. "You already knew what mattered most. I only helped uncover the paperwork." With that, he shook a few hands, nodded politely to everyone else, and stepped toward the front door. Harold walked him outside, through the picture window. I watched the two men stand on the porch for several minutes beneath the porch light. Harold's shoulders were slumped. Michael spoke calmly, resting a hand briefly on his shoulder before walking toward his car. The headlights disappeared between the pine trees. When Harold finally returned inside, he looked like a man who had aged 10 years in 10 minutes. He quietly closed the front door. No one said a word. He looked first at Walter, then at me. Finally, he spoke. I think Walter and Ashley should stay. Walter looked surprised. You still want us here? Harold nodded slowly. If we walk away now, we'll only spend the rest of our lives imagining conversations we were too afraid to have. Walter lowered his eyes. I don't deserve that kindness. Harold answered softly. This isn't kindness. It's the truth. He pulled out his chair but remained standing behind it. I owe everyone here an apology. His voice trembled. When I stood up before dinner, I believed I was making a generous announcement. I honestly thought I was giving my brother something that belonged to both Claudette and me. He turned toward Denise. I never imagined I was standing on top of 34 years of your mother's sacrifices. Denise's eyes filled with tears. Dad. He gently raised one hand. Please. I need to finish. He looked around the room. I've always been proud that I built this cabin. I've told that story hundreds of times. Everyone nodded. We had all heard it. Visitors loved hearing Harold explain how he selected every cedar beam, how he hauled stones from a nearby quarry to build the fireplace, and how he installed the windows himself before the first snowfall. Everything he ever said had been true. It simply hadn't been the whole truth. Harold looked at me. What I never told people was who worked late every evening so mortgage payments never arrived late. His voice became quieter. I never told them who paid contractors when I couldn't finish something myself. I never told them who skipped vacations because another property tax bill had arrived. I never told them who quietly balanced every budget. He swallowed. I became so proud of what these hands built. He looked down at his weathered palms. That I forgot whose hands had protected everything after construction ended. The room remained silent. Linda wiped tears from her eyes. I don't think you forgot. Harold looked toward her. I think you stopped noticing. Those words came from me. Not harshly, simply honestly. He nodded. You're right. I did. He slowly sat beside me. Not too close. As though he wasn't sure whether he still had that privilege. I've spent months thinking about retirement. I worried about money. I worried about getting older. I worried about leaving something meaningful behind. He sighed deeply. And somewhere along the way, I started believing my own version of history. I studied his face. There was no defensiveness left, only regret. Real regret rarely arrives dramatically. It arrives quietly when excuses finally become too heavy to carry. Walter suddenly stood. I can't listen to this anymore. Everyone looked toward him. I wasn't angry. He looked exhausted. I lied. I manipulated my brother. I involved my daughter. I nearly destroyed Thanksgiving. He rubbed both hands across his face. And somehow, everyone keeps talking about my financial problems. He shook his head. That isn't the worst thing I did. Ashley looked up. Dad? Walter looked directly at me. The worst thing was sitting at this table, watching Harold announce that the cabin was mine. His voice cracked. And I knew it wasn't really mine to receive. He laughed bitterly. I still let him finish. Nobody interrupted him. I watched everyone clap. I watched you sit there smiling. I even wondered why you weren't crying. He closed his eyes. I should have stopped Harold. I should have stood up and told everyone the truth. He looked toward his brother. I'm sorry. Harold didn't answer immediately. Instead, he asked one quiet question. Why didn't you? Walter stared toward the floor. Because I needed to believe one last miracle would save me. What miracle? The loan. The business. My reputation. He laughed again. I wasn't trying to save my company anymore. I was trying to save my pride. Those words settled heavily over the room. Pride. That tiny word had quietly damaged almost every relationship sitting around that table. Walter's pride had prevented him from asking for honest help. Harold's pride had allowed him to believe he alone represented the cabin. Even my own pride had nearly convinced me months earlier to confront them before I understood the full truth. Pride wears different faces, but it leaves similar scars. Ashley slowly stood beside her father. I have something to say too. Walter turned toward her. You don't have to. Yes, I do. She wiped tears from her cheeks. I became a real estate agent because I wanted people to trust me. She looked at me. Aunt Claudette, I should have called you. One phone call. That's all it would have taken. I would have learned the truth. She shook her head. But instead, I assumed. I trusted family instead of verifying facts. She smiled sadly. I guess that's a dangerous habit for both real estate agents and families. A few quiet smiles appeared around the table, not because anything was funny, because honesty sometimes brings relief, even painful honesty. Denise walked around the table and hugged Ashley. It's okay. Ashley immediately shook her head. No, it isn't. Not yet. She looked at me again. I don't expect forgiveness. I just hope someday you'll believe I truly never wanted to hurt you. I stood and embraced her. She began crying against my shoulder. I believe you. Those 4 words seemed to release something she'd been carrying all afternoon. Walter quietly wiped his eyes. Then he looked at me. I don't deserve another chance. No, I answered gently. You don't deserve another opportunity to deceive people. He nodded. I agree. But everyone deserves one opportunity to tell the truth. He looked genuinely surprised. So, you'll listen. I already am. The room became still again. Not tense, different, almost peaceful. For the first time since Harold's announcement before dinner, no one seemed interested in defending themselves. No one interrupted. No one argued. Everyone simply listened. As I looked around the cabin, I realized something I hadn't expected. The deepest wound that afternoon had never been about ownership. The cabin had always been legally protected. Michael had made that clear. The real damage had happened much earlier. It began the day we all stopped asking questions. The day assumptions quietly replaced conversations. The day invisible sacrifices became invisible people. And sitting there beside the man I had loved for 34 years, I finally understood what rebuilding our family would require. Not new legal documents, not another apology, not even time alone. It would require every one of us to learn a lesson we should have remembered long ago. Love cannot survive for very long where gratitude disappears. And gratitude begins with something surprisingly simple. Seeing the people whose quiet sacrifices made your own life possible. That night, after everyone finally left the cabin, felt larger than it ever had before. Not because the rooms had changed, because silence occupied every corner. The dirty dishes had been washed. The leftovers had been packed into containers. The dining table where our family had laughed, argued, cried, and uncovered decades of hidden truths stood empty beneath the warm glow of the chandelier. Harold remained seated long after everyone else had gone. He hadn't turned on the television. I hadn't poured himself another cup of coffee. He simply sat there staring at the empty chair where Walter had spent most Thanksgivings for the past 30 years. I wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and stepped onto the back porch. The air had turned bitterly cold. Snow continued falling in slow, graceful flakes, settling across the dock and the frozen shoreline. The lake reflected the moon so perfectly that it almost looked like another sky beneath my feet. A few moments later, I heard the screen door open behind me. Harold stepped outside carrying 2 mugs. He handed one to me. Chamomile tea. My favorite. I know. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Sometimes 34 years of marriage create a silence that doesn't need filling. Finally, Harold broke it. I've been thinking. I smiled faintly. I imagine you have. He let out a weary laugh. You know what hurts the most. I looked at him. I don't think it's Walter. It isn't. He shook his head. No. What hurts is realizing that none of what happened today would have surprised the man I used to be. I frowned slightly. What do you mean? He leaned against the porch railing. When we first met, I knew every sacrifice you made. I watched you work late. I watched you tutor children after school for free. I watched you save every extra dollar. I admired that. He looked toward the frozen lake. Somewhere over the years, I stopped admiring. I started expecting. His words settled heavily between us. Expectation. There was the invisible thief. Gratitude says, "Thank you for everything you do." Expectation says, "Of course you did it." The work remains exactly the same, only the appreciation disappears. Harold continued quietly. When visitors came to the cabin, I always gave the tour. You remember? I nodded. He smiled sadly. I'd point at the fireplace. I built that. I'd point toward the deck. I built that too. I'd point at the roof. I installed every beam. He looked down into his tea. I never once said, "My wife paid for every permit. My wife covered every mortgage payment. My wife made sure this place survived every recession." He shook his head slowly. I didn't lie. No, I answered gently. You told half the story. And after repeating half the story for 30 years, I started believing it was the whole story. I couldn't argue with that. Memory has an unusual habit. It edits itself. The stories we tell other people eventually become the stories we tell ourselves. If we leave out someone else's contribution often enough, we slowly convince ourselves it wasn't very important. Harold looked at me with tears gathering in his eyes. I don't know when I stopped seeing everything you carried. You carried our finances. You carried our schedules. You carried birthdays. You carried holidays. You carried my mother's medical appointments after my father died. He smiled painfully. You even remembered my brother's anniversaries better than they did. A tiny laugh escaped me. That's true, he nodded. And somehow, I convinced myself I was the one holding everything together. The honesty in his voice caught me off guard. This wasn't an apology prepared for an audience. There was no family left to impress. No attorney. No witnesses. Only the two of us. That made it far more meaningful. I need to ask you something. He looked almost afraid. Anything. Do you remember my parents? He smiled immediately. Of course. What do you remember most? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked across the lake toward the old maple trees. Your father. He always sharpened every tool before putting it away. And your mother. He smiled more warmly. She never let anyone leave hungry. I nodded. My father also taught me something else. Harold waited. He used to say, "The quickest way to lose a blessing is to begin believing you earned it alone." Harold closed his eyes. I think I did exactly that. You did, I answered softly. But you're not the only one. He frowned. What do you mean? I should have spoken years ago. His eyes opened. No, I should have. When your stories slowly stopped including me, I laughed. When people congratulated you for the cabin, I smiled. When someone assumed you'd paid for everything, I quietly changed the subject. I looked out toward the lake. I thought humility meant staying silent. I was wrong. He stared at me. You were protecting me. I was protecting peace, I corrected him. There's a difference. He considered that for several moments. I think I've confused peace with silence. So have I. We stood quietly together. The wind rustled through the pine trees surrounding the cabin. After several minutes, Harold asked the question I knew had been waiting inside him all evening. Can you ever trust me again? I didn't answer immediately, because trust deserves honesty more than speed. I don't know. His face fell. I appreciate your honesty. But I do know something. He waited. I don't believe you intentionally tried to steal from me. Relief flickered across his face. I believe you were careless. I believe you stopped paying attention. I believe you let someone else think for you. I looked directly into his eyes. And that can be just as dangerous. He nodded slowly. It was. I'll spend the rest of my life regretting today. I don't want that. He looked surprised. You don't. No. I don't want a husband who lives in regret. I want one who lives differently. His eyes filled again. I can do that. Can you? Yes. How? I thought for a long moment before answering. I'll stop assuming. I'll ask. I'll listen. I'll never sign another document without reading every word. A faint smile crossed my face. That's a good start. And he hesitated. I think we should tell the story correctly from now on. What story? Our story. He looked toward the cabin behind us. When people ask about this place, I'm going to tell them you found the land. You bought it. You protected it. I simply had the privilege of helping build your dream. For the first time that day, I felt something inside me soften. Not because of the words themselves, because Harold finally understood something money could never purchase. Recognition. Being seen. Not as the woman who cooked Thanksgiving dinner. Not as the wife who quietly handled bills, but as the person whose dream had given every member of our family a place to come home to. I reached over and took his hand. Not because everything had been repaired. It hadn't. Not even close. Trust doesn't return in one conversation. It returns in hundreds of small choices. But every rebuilding begins with a single brick. Tonight, Harold had laid the first one. And as we stood together beneath the falling snow, looking across the lake that had changed both of our lives, I quietly hoped we would have the courage to keep building, this time, together. The weeks after Thanksgiving were quieter than I expected. There were no dramatic phone calls, no angry letters from attorneys, no relatives choosing sides on social media. Real healing rarely announces itself. It begins in ordinary mornings when people decide whether they will repeat old habits or create new ones. December arrived early in northern Michigan. The first heavy snowfall buried the driveway leading to the cabin, and Harold insisted on driving north every Saturday to keep the roof clear of snow. For years, he had always said, "We should check on my cabin." The first Saturday after Thanksgiving, he reached for the truck keys and stopped halfway across the kitchen. He looked at me. "Would you like to go check on the cabin?" It was only one sentence. A tiny sentence. But I noticed something important. He hadn't called it his cabin. He hadn't even called it our cabin. He simply called it the cabin. Sometimes respect begins with changing the words we use. We spent the afternoon shoveling snow from the front porch, inspecting the roofline and carrying extra firewood inside. The silence between us no longer felt awkward. It felt careful, like two people learning how to speak a language they had almost forgotten. When we finished, Harold stood in the living room studying the family photographs on the wall. He stopped in front of one picture taken nearly 25 years earlier. Our daughter Denise stood between us holding a tiny bluegill she'd caught off the dock. "I remember this day." "So do I." "You were laughing because I dropped the fish." I smiled. "You screamed first." He laughed softly. "I did." Then his smile faded. "You know what I notice now?" "What?" "Every picture tells the same story." I looked at the wall. Children, grandchildren, birthdays, Christmases, fishing trips, graduations. What story? You. I looked at him. He pointed toward the photographs. "You were always behind the camera until someone insisted you get into the picture." I hadn't realized it. He was right. Most of the photographs existed because I had taken them. The memories were filled with everyone else. Very few included me. Harold sighed. "That's exactly what I did in our marriage." "What do you mean?" "I enjoyed everything you quietly created. But I rarely stopped long enough to notice who made it possible." Those words stayed with me for days. Not because they erased the hurt. Nothing could do that. But because they proved he was finally looking beneath the surface. Just before Christmas, Denise invited us to her house in Ohio. Normally, Walter joined us every holiday. This year he declined. He said he needed time. I understood. Shame often isolates people long before forgiveness reaches them. A week before Christmas Eve, Ashley called unexpectedly. "Can we meet?" Of course. We met at a small coffee shop in Traverse City. She looked exhausted. Dark circles surrounded her eyes. She smiled nervously. "I've been wanting to tell you something." "I'm listening." She slid a folder across the table. Inside were several pages. I resigned from handling any of Dad's business. I looked up. I couldn't keep pretending. She continued quietly. I also reported the loan application to my supervising broker. I blinked. You reported yourself? I had to. I prepared a valuation without verifying ownership. My license means too much to me. She smiled sadly. I nearly forgot that integrity matters more than family loyalty. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. I'm proud of you. Tears filled her eyes immediately. No one said that in weeks. They will. You did the difficult thing. She nodded. Dad isn't angry. He actually thanked me. That surprised me. Ashley smiled through her tears. He said maybe someone in our family should finally start telling the truth. I laughed softly. That's progress. It is. Before left, Ashley hesitated. There's something else. What is it? Dad sold his fishing boat. I frowned. I thought he loved that boat. He did. He also sold his classic pickup. And, she looked down, he's paying off as much debt as he can, without touching the cabin. For the first time since Thanksgiving, I felt genuine hope for Walter. Not because he had solved everything, because he had finally stopped searching for shortcuts. Honest work is always slower than deception, but it lasts longer. A few days later, Harold surprised me again. He invited Michael Donovan to lunch. The three of us met at a quiet restaurant overlooking the bay. After ordering sandwiches, Harold reached into his briefcase. I've been thinking. Michael smiled knowingly. I can see that. Harold slid several papers across the table. I want to change something. Michael adjusted his glasses. What am I looking at? A proposal. What kind? Harold looked toward me before answering. I'd like to remove myself as sole successor trustee. I stared at him. Harold. He smiled gently. Please let me finish. He turned back to Michael. I don't ever want there to be confusion again. The cabin exists because Claudette dreamed it. It survived because she protected it. I think future decisions should always begin with that truth. Michael slowly nodded. You understand what you're asking. I do. You'll no longer have independent authority over the property. I know. And you're comfortable with that? Harold smiled. For 34 years, I thought leadership meant making decisions. He reached across the table and took my hand. I've recently learned leadership sometimes means giving the right person the authority they deserved all along. My eyes filled with tears, not because of the legal paperwork, because he finally understood something much deeper. Authority isn't about control, it's about responsibility. Michael leaned back thoughtfully. I think there's an even better solution. Harold looked interested. What? The cabin shouldn't belong to one generation. It should belong to your family's values. He removed a legal pad and began sketching ideas. A protected heritage trust. The cabin can never be sold. It can never become collateral. It remains available to future generations. But ownership remains protected from individual financial problems. Harold smiled. Perfect. I looked at Michael. Can we really do that? He smiled. Absolutely. It simply requires the right documents. For the first time in months, the future felt brighter than the past. Not because our family had become perfect. Far from it. We still carried regret. Walter still faced enormous financial challenges. Trust still needed rebuilding. But we were finally building towards something instead of running from something. As we left the restaurant, snow began falling gently again. Harold slipped his hand into mine. I've been thinking about next Thanksgiving. I smiled. So have I. I hope everyone comes. I think they will. He looked toward the gray winter sky. And when they do, I'd like to tell the story correctly. What story? He smiled. The story of a young schoolteacher who bought a piece of shoreline before she met me. The story of a woman who refused to let anyone erase her parents' final gift. The story of my wife. I squeezed his hand. For the first time in a very long while, the future sounded like home again. By the time spring arrived, The cabin no longer felt like the place where our family had nearly fallen apart. It felt like the place where we had finally stopped pretending. Northern Michigan has a way of reminding people that no season lasts forever. Snow eventually melts into streams that feed the lake. Bare maple branches become green again. The same shoreline that looks lifeless in January fills with wildflowers by May. Healing, I discovered, follows much the same pattern. It doesn't happen overnight. It happens one honest day at a time. Harold and I drove to Michael Donovan's office on a bright April morning. The courthouse square was already busy when we arrived. Local shop owners were sweeping sidewalks, tourists wandered through downtown, carrying coffee, and the old church bell rang 10 o'clock, just as we stepped inside the historic brick building where Michael had practiced law for more than 30 years. He greeted us with his usual warm smile. "I've been looking forward to today." "So have we," Harold answered. Michael spread several neatly organized folders across the conference table. "I've prepared the final draft." I looked at the title printed across the first page: Monroe Family Heritage Trust. Just reading those words brought unexpected emotion to my chest. For months, the cabin had represented conflict. Now it represented something entirely different: hope. Michael adjusted his glasses. "I've incorporated everything we discussed." He slowly reviewed each section. "The cabin cannot be sold. It cannot be used as collateral. It cannot secure loans. It cannot be transferred by one family member acting alone." Harold nodded after every sentence. "Good," Michael continued. "Future generations may use the property. They may celebrate holidays here. They may stay here. They may bring their children. But no individual beneficiary may claim exclusive ownership." I smiled. My father would have loved that. Michael smiled back. "I suspected as much." He turned another page. "There is one additional provision." Harold looked curious. "What is it?" Michael read directly from the document. "The cabin shall exist as a place of family gathering, reflection, gratitude, and shared memory. Decisions regarding the property shall prioritize preservation over financial gain." The room fell quiet. No one spoke for several seconds. Finally, Harold whispered, "That's exactly what this place should be." Michael handed us each a pen. "If you're both comfortable, we can sign today." Harold looked at me first. Not the paperwork, not Michael, me. "Are you ready?" That simple question nearly brought tears to my eyes. Months earlier, he had signed documents without asking me. Now he refused to sign anything before hearing my answer. "Yes, I am." Together we signed the trust. The sound of two pens moving across paper seemed surprisingly significant. Not because legal documents solve emotional wounds, they don't. But because these signatures represented something entirely different from the ones Harold had placed on Walter's paperwork. These signatures were informed, shared, equal. After the final page was completed, Michael placed everything neatly inside a blue folder. "Congratulations." "What happens now?" I asked. He smiled. "Now, your family has something stronger than ownership. You have protection." As we prepared to leave, Harold turned toward Michael. "Thank you." Michael shook his head. "Don't thank me. Thank your wife. If she had chosen anger instead of patience, none of us would be standing here today." Harold looked at me quietly. "I know." A week later, something happened I hadn't expected. Walter called. "Could we meet at the cabin?" I hesitated. "Just the two of us." His voice sounded different, not desperate, simply tired. I agreed. Saturday afternoon found us sitting on the old wooden dock where he and Harold had spent so many summers fishing together. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. The lake was calm. A pair of loons drifted across the water. Finally, Walter broke the silence. "I sold the company." I looked at him. "I heard. I couldn't save it." "No, I couldn't." He skipped a small stone across the lake. "I also filed for bankruptcy." "I'm sorry," he shrugged. "It's embarrassing. But it's honest." Another long silence followed. "I brought something." He reached into an old canvas backpack and removed a worn leather photo album. I found this while cleaning my office. He handed it to me. Inside were dozens of photographs: Harold building the fireplace, me painting the kitchen cabinets, Walter helping install the dock, children swimming, my parents sitting on the porch only months before my mother passed away. Then I reached the final page, a photograph I'd never seen before. I stood beside the empty piece of land on the day I purchased it. My father had one arm around my shoulders. My mother stood beside me, smiling proudly. On the back, written in my father's familiar handwriting, were 7 simple words. Dreams survive when families protect them together. My vision blurred. I've never seen this. Walter nodded. Dad took it. He gave me a copy years ago. Why didn't you ever show me? He stared across the water. I forgot. Then he laughed softly. No, I didn't. I was ashamed. Every time I looked at that picture, I remembered whose dream this really was. He took a deep breath. I owe you something. You don't owe me money. He smiled sadly. I couldn't pay enough anyway. I owe you respect. He looked directly at me. I'm sorry I stopped seeing you. I believed him, not because his words were perfect, because they cost him something to say. Forgiveness doesn't begin when someone says the right sentence. It begins when pride finally leaves the room. As we walked back toward the cabin, Harold stepped onto the porch. The two brothers stood looking at each other for a long moment. Neither moved. Finally, Harold walked forward. Walter quietly said, I'm sorry. Harold answered, I know. Then they hugged. No speeches, no dramatic music, no applause, just two aging brothers finally choosing honesty over ego. That evening, the three of us carried old boxes down from the attic. Inside were decades of forgotten family photographs. We spent hours labeling names and dates on the back so future generations would know who everyone was. Harold suddenly held up one faded picture. Look. It showed me standing beside the unfinished cabin holding a clipboard full of invoices while Harold hammered cedar siding onto the wall. He laughed. This picture finally tells the whole story. I smiled. No. It tells the beginning. He looked puzzled. What do you mean, the whole story? I looked around the cabin. Isn't about who paid. Or who built. It's about what we finally learned. He nodded slowly. And what did we learn? I smiled toward the lake glowing beneath the setting sun. That a family legacy isn't protected by walls. It's protected by truth. Outside, the first birds of spring sang from the maple trees my younger self had planted decades earlier. The cabin still stood exactly where it always had. Only the people inside had changed. And for the first time in a very long while, that felt like the strongest foundation of all. The next Thanksgiving arrived almost exactly 1 year after the dinner that changed our family forever. Once again, I woke before sunrise. Some habits are too precious to surrender. At 64, I still found comfort in those quiet hours before everyone else arrived. The cabin rested peacefully beneath a thin layer of fresh snow, and the lake stretched across the horizon like polished silver beneath the early morning sky. I stepped onto the porch carrying my first cup of coffee. The 2 maple trees I had planted nearly 4 decades earlier had grown even taller. Their branches were bare now, but they stood exactly as they always had, steady through every season, every storm, every celebration, and every sorrow. I smiled to myself. So did we. Behind me, the screen door opened. This time, I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Harold wrapped a warm blanket around my shoulders before saying a single word. The coffee's getting cold. I laughed softly. You've been saying that for 34 years. And you've ignored me for 34 years. I probably always will. He smiled. I hope so. There was something wonderfully ordinary about the conversation. No tension, no hidden fears, just two people growing older together. Sometimes healing isn't dramatic. Sometimes it sounds exactly like an old married couple teasing each other before breakfast. By mid-morning, the cabin slowly filled with familiar sounds. Car doors slammed outside. Children ran across the porch. Someone laughed before even entering the front door. The smell of roasted turkey filled every room. Denise arrived first carrying homemade rolls. Mark followed with 2 pumpkin cheesecakes. Ethan, now nearly grown, immediately volunteered to carry firewood inside. "I've got it, Grandma." "I know you do." He smiled proudly. Ashley arrived a little later. She looked happier than she had the year before, healthier, more peaceful. She hugged me tightly. "I brought something." She handed me a framed photograph. It was the picture Walter had given me months earlier, the one showing my parents standing beside me on the day I bought the property. Ashley had restored the faded colors. The lake looked blue again. My father's flannel shirt appeared bright red. My mother's smile seemed almost alive. Across the bottom of the frame, she'd engraved a simple sentence: "Every family begins with someone's dream." My eyes immediately filled with tears. "It's beautiful." She smiled. "I thought it belonged here." "It does." We placed the photograph on the fireplace mantel where everyone could see it. Just before noon, another truck slowly pulled into the driveway. Conversation inside the cabin became noticeably quieter. Walter stepped out alone. He wasn't wearing an expensive leather jacket anymore. His old pickup truck was gone. Instead, he arrived in a modest used sedan. He carried only one thing: a pecan pie. He stood awkwardly at the front door until Harold opened it. For several seconds, neither brother spoke. Finally, Walter extended the pie. "I remembered it's your favorite." Harold smiled. "It always has been." Walter nodded. "I wasn't sure if—" He struggled to finish. "If I was still welcome." Harold stepped aside. "You'll always have to earn trust." Walter lowered his eyes. "I know. But you'll never have to earn a seat at Thanksgiving." Walter's eyes filled instantly. He walked inside quietly. No applause greeted him. No dramatic speeches. Just family. Exactly as it should be. Lunch unfolded differently this year. Not because the food had changed, because the conversations had. People asked questions. They listened more carefully. Nobody interrupted. Nobody assumed. Even the smallest interactions felt different. At one point, Ethan pointed toward the framed photograph above the fireplace. "Grandma!" "Who's that?" I walked over beside him. "That's your great-grandfather. And your great-grandmother. They're the reason we're all here." He studied the picture. "So they built the cabin." I smiled. "No. They gave me the courage to." He nodded thoughtfully. Children understand more than adults sometimes realize. Later that afternoon, after everyone had finished eating, Harold stood beside the fireplace. Immediately, the room grew quiet. The memory of the previous Thanksgiving still lingered in everyone's mind. He smiled gently. "I know what you're all thinking." Several people laughed. "No. This isn't another surprise announcement." The laughter grew louder. Even Walter smiled. Harold reached toward the framed photograph. "I just want to tell the story correctly." He looked around the room. "When visitors ask about this cabin, I've spent years telling them I built it." He paused. "That wasn't a lie. But it wasn't the truth either." He turned toward me. "The truth is, my wife dreamed of this place before she ever met me. She bought the land. She paid every mortgage. She protected it through difficult years. I had the privilege of helping build her dream." Then he looked toward our grandchildren. "I want every generation after us to remember something. Houses are built with lumber. Families are built with sacrifice. And the greatest sacrifices are usually made quietly." The room remained completely silent, not uncomfortable, moved. Walter slowly stood. "I'd like to add something." Everyone turned toward him. "I spent years believing success meant owning more. Bigger businesses, bigger loans, bigger opportunities." He looked around the room. "I almost lost my family chasing something that was never really mine." He smiled toward me. "Thank you for refusing to hate me." I answered honestly. "It would have been easier." He nodded. "I know. But easier isn't always better." Ashley quietly wiped away tears. Denise leaned against Mark's shoulder. Even Ethan looked unusually thoughtful. A little later, the grandchildren asked if they could roast marshmallows by the fire pit near the lake. Harold looked at me. "What do you think?" I smiled. "I think that's exactly what this place was meant for." As evening settled over the lake, everyone gathered outside. The children laughed while roasting marshmallows. Walter and Harold repaired one loose board on the dock together. Ashley helped Denise decorate the porch with evergreen garlands. I sat on the old wooden bench beneath the maple trees, the same trees I had planted as a young woman with dirt beneath my fingernails and hope in my heart. Harold quietly joined me. "You know what I've been thinking about last Thanksgiving." I smiled. "I had a feeling you might." He laughed. "When you said, 'Let's wait until dessert,' I honestly thought you were trying to embarrass me." I looked toward the glowing cabin. "No, I was trying to save you." He frowned gently. "How? If I'd interrupted your announcement, you would have defended yourself. You would have defended Walter. Everyone would have remembered the argument." He nodded slowly. "But by waiting, you gave everyone time to become one family before asking them to hear one difficult truth." "Exactly." He reached for my hand. "I don't think I've ever thanked you for that." "You just did." He smiled. The cabin lights reflected across the calm lake. Laughter drifted from the fire pit. The smell of pine wood smoke and pumpkin pie filled the cold evening air. For a long moment, I simply watched my family. Not a perfect family, not a family without mistakes, but a family finally willing to choose truth over pride. As I looked at the cabin, I realized something that had taken me nearly 40 years to understand. The greatest inheritance my parents left me was never the money that bought this land. It was the wisdom to protect what truly mattered. Property can be inherited, money can be earned, buildings can be rebuilt. But trust must be chosen, again and again, every single day. And perhaps that was why I had waited until dessert. Not to win an argument, not to shame my husband, but to remind everyone sitting around that table that gratitude always tastes sweeter when it is served with the truth.